Chapter 2, Part 1. Little Jim Nantuck. Jonah Unger wanted the end. He saw the grey shape of Rupert Fuchs running through the snow ahead of him. He knew Lieutenant Durant and Sergeant Renoir were just beyond Rupert, charting the course. He sensed James Cox and saw his arms pumping in his peripheral vision. He heard Captain Strothman coming just behind them, his presence urging Jonah to keep pressing forward. The pressure his peers were applying was all that kept him from laying down and succumbing. It was the horses that had done it. The sight of them sapped his will to live. That early morning in 1915, the revisitation of the sights, sounds and smells of the day were triggered by the brave British cavalryman. He had managed to suppress the memory for 2 years, crushing it into a tight ball and shoving it into the corner of a deep hall closet in his mind, slamming the door shut and bolting it, nailing sturdy beams across the threshold to keep it interred. The mental exercise had been a success. It held the memory at bay, or at least kept it out of the sunlight. But it seemed now that all the effort was in vain. In the dark closet of memory, the thing his actions birthed must have continued to grow and flourish, feeding on the darkness, and now it seemed to have found a key and escaped, a fully matured black mass inside of him. The wheat field had been prime, green and still growing, the spears thick, the stems and stalks seeming longer by the second. Unfortunately, the men who should have been champing at the bit to reap the harvest of their laborious planting were dead, or on their way to it. The patriarch Thierry died of a heart attack when the family fled the German invasion. The eldest son, Michel, was killed on the battlefield 2 weeks after he graduated from infantry school. The youngest son, Henri, too young to join the French army, currently lay in hospital, dying of influenza he contracted as he and his mother moved from refuge to refuge, seeking shelter in Paris. But the sum total of the men's labours had outlived them all and was in a gorgeous state. Had they lived to see their field, pride and avarice would have moved through all of them. The harvest would have been spectacular, the cash return huge. Jonah walked through the winter wheat, stunned. Wolfgang Strothman was near at hand, Lieutenant Diestel too, whose quiet gallows laughter was the only thing Jonah heard over the tinny ring in his ears. The green wheat brushed his knees and he wished he could smell it, but his nose was filled by the stench of machine gun oil, burnt lead, and ignited white powder. The sun caught the bright, shining horse hides perfectly. Their brushed coats and braided manes gleamed in brown, honey, and gold tones. The blacks of fetlocks and forelegs shone like pitch. The white diamonds on their foreheads and chests gleamed like fresh paint. Their riding tack was immaculate, polished saddles and reins, shining brass and silvery steel bits between their teeth. The blood was the brightest shade of red Jonah had ever seen. Jonah staggered. His acne-pocked loader, Ernst Steiner, grabbed him and helped him stay standing. "Chin up, Jonah. Chin up," Ernst said. Jonah nodded. He did not want to look like a weakling, especially in the presence of Lieutenant Diestel, who never let up with the ridicule and name-calling of his little Jew gunner. Looking as though he had lost his appetite for war, would lead to no end of abuse, and in Jonah's experience, abusive behavior spiraled at the first sign of weakness in the victim. He would walk this field as brazenly as Lieutenant Diestel, or die trying. Jonah did not count the dead horses. Later, he was told there were 144 of them. He could not help but keep count of the still living ones he finished at close range. 8. 8 magnificent beasts in various states of suffering that he, or one of the other 2 gunners, began killing with their machine guns and now had to summarily finish with a bullet to the head. He shut his eyes each time he fired his rifle. There were 85 dead men, too, and a score of stunned survivors and wounded, but they were not put down. They were catalogued and disarmed, sent to the rear to suffer the loss of their equine companions in prison camps for the remainder of the war. After the last dying horse was extinguished, Jonah's company moved forward. The 12th ASC Labour Battalion arrived, and before midday had crafted a long, zigzagging trench at the far edge of the field. The battlements would only deepen and grow from there, shooting arteries out in all directions like a living thing, a virulent, spreading cancer fed on the industrial scale bloodletting that took place above it. By mid-afternoon, Jonah and Ernst had finished setting up their MG-08 in its emplacement. They secured it with sandbags around the tripod, on a perfect fire step that would keep them low enough to avoid snipers, but high enough to direct their field of fire into any British infantrymen sent screaming in their directions, bayonets fixed, killing faces engaged. The wind washed a bitter scent over Jonah and Ernst. Jonah looked back at the field of green wheat. The Labour Battalion had stripped the dead horses of their riding tack and dropped it all into wagon beds. All the leather and metal would be put to good use, nothing wasted. Then they began the butchering. The ripe blood, organs and intestines, the stench of an open-air slaughterhouse, caught by an easterly spring breeze, nearly brought Jonah to tears. The meat and organs would end up in stew pots. The beautiful hides would become gloves, belts, boots, and black leather gaiters for German officers. The intestines would be stretched and strung into suture thread for the medical corps. The rest, the bones and cartilage, the spilled blood and brains, would stay in the field, feeding the green wheat's roots until it flourished to full growth. Then the stalks would be scythed down, ground to flour, and baked into loaves of bread for the army. Nothing wasted. Everything wasted. Jonah was given the Iron Cross, First Class, for gallantry. He survived 2 more years of war and never fought off another cavalry charge. He purposefully avoided looking at horses that entire time. Of course, he was aware when a quartet of the beasts hauled artillery past or dragged the field kitchen up for a hot breakfast. But for 31 months, he succeeded in never looking directly at a horse again. It was a curious feat, but he managed it quite well. If he could pretend the horses were not there, he could certainly pretend that all the ones he had machine-gunned and mercy murdered did not still reside in a dark closet in his brain. But now, with the world at its end, the sight of the British horsemen coming to their rescue had broken that streak and broken the door that held those memories fast, and he felt them charging out of it. The memory was alive. It felt as real as if it was all happening again. The recall of that Indian summer morning and all that came with it filled him to his toes, engulfing him, stampeding over him, revealing him as broken, trampled, his insides, his soul, his very being smashed to nothing by the things he had done and seen. Jonah prayed. He prayed for death to find him quickly and put him out of his misery so he would not have to do it himself. No answer to his prayers came. For now, buoyed solely by his mates, he ran on. Durant was leading the way, 20 feet ahead of Jonah, with Renoir just behind him. After them came little Rupert Fuchs, followed by Jonah Unger and James Cox running in tandem. Wolfgang was at the rear, alternating between looking back for pursuers and looking ahead to where his brother's murderer cut a path in the snow behind Durant. More than once he considered accelerating and running Alexander Renoir down right then, tackling, then bludgeoning him to death with his bare hands. Voices in his head were urging him to the deed, screaming for vengeance. But Wolfgang held back their entreaties for now. He would know for certain, and then he would act. Until then, survival was paramount. When dawn came and the monster pursuing them fell, he would find out the truth. Then what would be, would be. Durant stopped and the others caught up, huddling around him. We should be near San Quentin soon. We'll keep to the woods and skirt it until we reach the river, and then we can follow it back toward the city until we find the cavalryman's boat. Make sense? Durant asked. There was no conversation. Wolfgang translated for Jonah and Rupert. They nodded, understanding. What about everybody else? Asked James. Durant considered it. I don't know. I don't know where they all split off to. I don't know who made it through the wire and who didn't. And I don't see any way in hell we want to head back toward what was coming after us. I think we'll have to hope the cavalrymen can round them up or lead the... Durant had trouble summoning a fitting word for the monsters. The things away from us. Maybe they'll be able to pick up everyone else's trail in the morning, bring them along to the boat. I don't know. There was silence. Durant stood and led his companions on towards San Quentin at a steady run. This was not the first time Durant had run in snow from death. When he and his brother arrived in the northernmost Canadian territories, the first snows of winter had already begun. They would grow much worse before any weak springtime reached the tundra and turned the ice to running rivulets, creeks, and rivers of pure water. But no amount of melted snow would wash away the blood that followed in their steps. Before Matthew and David reached Vancouver, they stayed the night with an old friend of Matthew's in Kamloops on the Thompson River. After David went to bed, Matthew stayed up into the early morning hours in deep discussion with his pal. He sold their father's wagon and team to him at a bargain rate. Then they took their guns and money the rest of the way by riverboat. In Vancouver, on the very same docks that Chen Su and his comrades would be ushered through en route to the Great European War, they booked passage on a steamer bound for the Yukon Territory. It took nearly a week in rough seas to reach Skagway, and another 5 days beyond that to make their way by wagon team to Carcross. They rode into town as the sun set. Even in the gloaming, Matthew knew exactly where he was headed. When they left what little there was of Carcross's main drag behind them, David turned to Matthew. "Where are we going?" Matthew smirked. "Belly of the beast. We're going to pay a call on my old pal, Hamish Jarmish. See if we can't make a bargain with him." David hesitated. "I thought you said the Mounties were after you, but you got in a gunfight with them." Matthew laughed. In a manner of speaking. It was more of a simple misunderstanding than anything else. What I failed to mention is that Captain Jarmish doesn't know that I partook in said gunfight. It'd be best if we kept it that way. You understand? "Yes," David said. Matthew continued, "I used some of Papa's money to clear my debt. I got a feeling Captain Jarmusch can put us to use, and we can earn it all back, and then some. Then leave here free and clear. Not afraid of a little hard work, are you? No, I'm not afraid of work, David said. He should have been. Smoke wafted out of the stone chimney in Hamish's log cabin. Matthew reined in the team and pulled the wagon to a stop in front of it. Stay where he can see you. Keep your hands high so he can tell that they're empty. He might come out a little hot, but I'll manage him. David swallowed his fear and nodded. Matthew looped the reins and stood in the buckboard. He raised his hands and called out, "Captain Jarmusch, it's Matty Durant out here. I know you're in there, enjoying your fire and, like as not, a bit of Scotch whiskey. I feel pretty certain you got a Winchester aimed at me right now, and I don't take that hard at all. Come on out, let's have a parley, Captain. I didn't come back to do you wrong. No siree. I came to make things right." The door to the cabin swung open. A big man stepped through, the hitch in his gait, remnant of his stretch killing Boers in South Africa for the British Army 10 years past, did nothing to diminish him. The limp may have been distinct, but it gave no whiff of handicap in the big man. He wore the yellow-striped blue breeches of the Northwest Mounted Police, tucked into polished knee-high boots. His red tunic hung loose and unbuttoned. A thick salt and pepper mustache curved around the ends of a smile as he studied the two young men in the wagon. In his hands was a .404 caliber Nitro Express elephant gun. Hamish had used it to kill 17 Boer men, women, and children, 1 leopard, 2 lions, a Cape buffalo, 1 black rhino, 3 elephants, plus 100 and some American buffalo back on the North American continent. He would have tried for 100 more, had the northern herds not dwindled away to nothing. Hamish grinned. "Matthew Durant, as I live and fucking breathe. And with some kind of fucking kin, too. Spit an image of you. My Winchester's still in the rack, but this one here is nothing to sneeze at. Like as not, if I pull the trigger, she'll cut the pair of you in half from nut sacks on up." Matthew smiled. "Well, I can't say as I'd like that very much, Captain. Wouldn't like it even a little. I know we parted company under circumstances beyond my control. And if it didn't weigh a little on my conscience, I'd still be in San Francisco, living the life. I'm here to make amends." "Amends? Shit, son. I'm pretty sure you're here to get your name off the wanted list." "Well, sir, now that you mention it," Matthew replied with a grin. "What you owe, plus interest. Wouldn't have it any other way. Glad of that. On the question of interest, wasn't a question in that sentence. Apologize if it sounded like there were," Hamish said. Matthew nodded. "Yes, I understand. But the thing is, I can pay you the principal in cash right now. Then we can work off the interest and go our separate ways, if that'd be all right with you." "Ha! And how would you intend to do that?" "Well, Captain, according to the papers and our mutual friend down in Kamloops, I know you've got some business with the Injuns. You spend a lot of time reading the papers, do you? You never struck me as the reading type. More as a pastime than anything else, but any time I see an acquaintance mentioned in print, I don't pass it by." "They mentioned yours truly by name?" asked Hamish. Matthew shrugged. "Well, not specifically, but I knew when they mentioned the Northwest Mounties they were talking about you for certain." Hamish released the rifle's hammer and rested the weapon on his shoulder. Matthew's eyes twinkled. "You know, I've got good friends, among the Tagish elders. I did right by them. They did right by me, even if it did upset some friends of yours. I think I could save you a headache. I can talk them into letting go of their tots and sending them to boarding school without a fight. But not the one up here. The one near Vancouver. My brother and I will wrangle the kids, take them south, and leave them in care of the nuns and priests. I'd be happy to take a deputization and handle it all for you. Hamish laughed. What's your angle here, Durant? Like I said, clear my debt, clear my name, go on with my life in a prosperous fashion. That's the long and short of it. I don't believe you for a fucking minute. There is the per-child bounty to think of, Matthew said. There was a brief pause as the gears turned in Hamish's brain. Hadn't heard about that, Hamish replied. Well, sir, said Matthew, in order to keep the government checks coming, the boarding schools have to meet student quotas. If I help the Catholics meet their numbers, you can bet that some of that government money is going to come my way. And I don't see why we wouldn't give you a solid cut of it. Stands to reason. Then there's a deal to be had. I'll count my cash on the barrel first, then get an exact figure what my cut would be, and we can go from there. I'd expect no less. Matthew turned to David. Brother, grab the cash box, would you? David was numb, but he nodded. He climbed into the wagon bed and rummaged for the black metal box. He hefted it by its brass handle and carried it back out. As he entered his cabin, Hamish Jarmusch unconsciously echoed what their father had said upon Matthew's homecoming. Come on in if you're coming. The brothers followed him in.